This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living out the Catholic faith, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now, your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor at Sacred Heart Parish and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. Today is the feast day of one of the most unlikely saints in the Roman calendar. I know there's a good deal of competition for that title, given the surprising working of grace in our hearts, but it's hard to escape the uniqueness of the holiness of St. Monica, the mother of St. Augustine, whose feast day is today. It would pay to spend a bit of time reflecting on her and her example, as well as to acknowledge that the saints of yesterday are not always like the saints of today, which is another way of saying that holiness is not a mold to be poured into. Rather, it's a hope to be realized. And that hope is alive in every age. When it's realized, it takes on its unique form, shaped around the personality and the history of the person who is a saint. And no one fits that description better than Monica. Monica was born in the year 332 in Tagaste, what is now Algeria in North Africa. For us, this is a remote and forbidding place, both because it's in Africa and borders the Sahara Desert, as well as the fact that it was not a part of the active engaged world where news is made and reported from. We're more likely to know about this part of the world by studying World War II than we are by reading the international headlines or studying the economics of trade and transportation. But it was not the case when Monica first opened her eyes to the world. It was a thriving Roman city in what had been the Numidian kingdom. For centuries prior to her time, it had been knitted into alliances with the local power of Carthage. In her time, it was woven into the Roman Empire and enjoyed the benefits and certainties of Roman life at the time. We think of North Africa as being in the boondocks, something like, growing up in Idaho or perhaps in northern Utah. The truth of the matter is somewhat different. Paris and Trier at that time were the true frontiers, not Africa. England was the great beyond, not Algeria. Her town was near the breadbasket of Rome and part of the great trading and business network the empire depended on for its dynamism in life. Rather than Butte or Bismarck, it was Omaha or maybe Cincinnati. And instead of being on the far end of the life of the times, there were thriving cities all around, each a place where Roman values and the Roman way of life was valued and practiced. Monica is a name that has Berber roots, the people of that part of Africa. They are often pictured as burnous-wearing camel drivers, and this is accurate enough. If we imagine, say, all pilgrims to be black-headed and silver-buckled, or all Plains Indians to have eagle-feathered war bonnets. In truth, the Berbers were the indigenous builders of this part of the world with their own language, culture, and history. Monica was a product of their presence there. This probably indicates she had the features of a Berber woman. Such things didn't seem to make much difference in the Roman way of life. In all of ancient literature, there is little distinction made in skin color and the texture of a person's hair. These attributes didn't seem to matter much then. So we don't know what she looked like, if her features would have been more like the current population of northern Africa or more like the residents of Rome. These questions about her were never asked because they never were seen to be important to anyone at her time, and so were never answered. Historians describe her as of Romanized Berber origin. That simply indicates she was a Roman citizen from that part of the world. It doesn't say much to us of our concerns about her family roots or what she may or may not have looked like. She was married to a pagan Roman named Patricius. He was a leader in the town and part of the prosperous caste of citizens, a burgher of repute and respect. It was said he was of violent temper, but it's hard to understand what that actually means in our own evaluation of things in our day and time, because the standards for such things have changed so much. They've changed just since the time of my father, much less over the last 1,500 years. Suffice it to say, he, Patricius, was held in respect by the people of Tagaste, both as a family man and as a man of substance and leadership. Again, according to the sources, He was reputed to be an adulterer, which was unsurprisingly difficult for his wife. St. Monica had to deal with his position and apparently with his disinterest while caring for her children. The accusation of adultery doesn't have quite the same flavor in their time as in ours. The expectations of the roles of men and women in marriage, especially in that pagan society, having been somewhat different than ours in our own time. But Monica did have to deal with the realities of her husband's way of life as she navigated the complicated hallways of life in her place and time. She receives much sympathy for her patience and fortitude and how she was able to live in that environment, although we should know the normal practice of family life and the presumptions of fidelity were different in everyone's mind at that time, including in her own. She was a patient wife, and she did have to deal with her husband's flaws, but this did not particularly set her apart in her place and time. Patricius was a pagan who was at least tolerant of Monica's Christianity. The Christians were a growing community at the time, and to be a part of the church there was not thought strange or alien, although it was not universal. Her husband does not appear often in the historical resources we have, so we know very little about his particular approach to her embrace of the faith. We do know it would not have been thought of a positive element in his role as a politician and leader, although it probably wouldn't have disqualified him from fulfilling that role. According to the later descriptions of him, he was stubborn in dealing with his wife, and he wasn't enthusiastic about her practice of the faith. But he was committed to giving his sons a good education and seeing them prosper. Now, Monica's fame is due to the stellar reputation of her son, St. Augustine. He was a bishop for more than 30 years, during which time he preached and taught and administered amid the Catholic community in his diocese. His impact on Christianity has been enormous, especially in the West, not so much in the East. But from the time he was bishop in Hippo Regius in North Africa up to today, his points of view and his analysis of what it means to live the Christian life according to the Scriptures has helped to shape everyone's point of view. During my time in my doctoral program at the end of the 1990s at the Association of Chicago Theological Schools, all Protestant, and then my participation in the Princeton School of Theology Pastor Theologian program with all of my colleagues being Protestant pastors, I was overwhelmed by their adherence to and citation of the theology of St. Augustine. He is still the eminent theologian of record for just about everybody who's a Christian. Just take a look at Pope Benedict XVI. He was an expert on the theology of St. Augustine and quoted him over and over in the midst of his teaching and writing on the concerns of our day. Augustine's reputation as a deep thinker and a wise scholar has seldom been matched. He was important. His most popular book was his Confessions. This book was essentially the first autobiography, and it describes his reflections on the growth of his interior life and the process of his conversion. It was the most popular book published in the Christian world, besides the Bible, for more than 1,000 years. In addition, his more than 500 sermons, and those are the ones that have survived, he is said to have published somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 sermons altogether. And his books on the Trinity, on God's providence, and on the development of theology, as well as his letters, add up to a hefty bookshelf of works. His scholarship shaped Catholic life irrevocably. But even more than the sum of his writing, Augustine was famous for the facts surrounding his conversion. He was a rebellious young man who took a mistress as a teenager, had a son by her, went off to school to reinforce his professional career, dabbled with a couple of non-Christian religions, and then eventually was baptized into the Catholic Church. These facts of his life have endured him to untold generations, and his search for the truth, as he sought the meaning of his own life in the teachings of the Church, has made his story one that has provided both hope and joy to the millions who've come to know of him and his pathway to conversion. Virtually every Catholic for the last 1,500 years who has journeyed from confusion and license to faith and commitment has been compared to the Bishop of Hippo. Augustine ascribed his journey to the faith to the power of God's Word to illumine his soul and quiet his fears, and to the faithful support and prayer of his mother, Monica. And throughout her life, Monica was a steady presence for Augustine and never tired of calling him to the dignity of an ordered and decent life. She was a leader among the women of her place and a recognized champion of the charity and works of the Church among those most in need. But in the middle of this, she was also the faithful mother who supported her son as much as she could and prayed for him always. Her husband died in middle age, so she was left to make her way in the world, depending a great deal on her son and for his support of her. And it was obvious he depended on her a great deal for his own emotional support and steadiness. They were very much intertwined with each other and make for an interesting duo as we celebrate their sanctity together. It should also be mentioned that Monica had her faults, as does every saint. She was overbearing, not just to her son, who complained about this aspect of her personality, but she was also overbearing to her bishop, who warned her over and over again about some of her prayer practices and her support of some pretty dodgy teachings of the time. There was a lot more variety in the Catholic practices of the time, and some of the traditions that had grown up amid the people in North Africa were disturbing to the ecclesial authorities of the time. St. Monica had to be admonished from time to time in order to remain in good odor with those in charge. She certainly wouldn't be the first woman saint to be reprimanded for her enthusiasms, and after all, there were plenty of men who fell into this category. But it does seem to be more of an attribute among women than among men, I have to say. In all of these things, she was a woman of her time. All saints display their holiness in the context of their place and time. This is one of the gifts they all give us. Sainthood is not a mold that forms an individual into a particular kind of person. It's an accomplishment of each person who strives to live life in Christ. This life is accomplished amid all of the anxieties and challenges of the particular place and time the person is living. When we look to the lives of saints for inspiration and examples, we don't seriously expect to model ourselves on the exact details of the saints' lives, but on how they acted and responded to the realities and the challenges they faced. If we look at Blessed Stanley Rother's life of holiness, for example, we don't have to imagine ourselves becoming a missionary in order to appreciate how his example of sanctity could become a model for us. Nor do we have to imagine facing an assassination squad in the middle of the night in a foreign country in order to know that our challenge to tell the truth might be difficult for us. His holiness is embodied by his actions in his environment. They become the means by which we see and understand what it means to be holy. For us, St. Monica is an example of fortitude and patience. She's also the paradigm of the Christian who knows how to sustain and nurture. And probably the most important element in her relationship with her son is that she did not turn her back on him or on his future, even when he made decisions she did not support and that were not congenial to her. Rather than excoriating him or decisively berating him for messing his life up, she kept to her values, practiced her faith, and kept him in her prayers. Many of us could take lessons from her approach. Many do. Another aspect of her sanctity that I most appreciate is the realization of her holiness amid the trying times in the church of the day. Of course, we know the church is tried in every age, and in every age, those who are faithful to her teaching suffer these trials. In the midst of the difficulties, the church learns how to respond and prosper. And by the church, we mean the people, the individuals who are weathering the challenges they face. Bishops and priests and parishioners don't live apart from their time. They only know what they know at the time. They have to learn and adjust as believers and as mortals facing all of the difficulties of their day. St. Monica couldn't look out her window to see what the church would become in another 500 years and look forward to Gothic cathedrals or Thomistic syllogisms and the inculturation of Catholic virtues. All she could see was her day and time and the striving of the church to follow the teachings of Christ. She lived her days one day at a time, like all the rest of us do. At that time, in the North African church, everyone was dealing with the outcome of the scandal of the clergy. What had happened was that during the intermittent Roman persecutions in the previous generation, some of the clergy had betrayed their promises and had denied the faith. They'd turned over the chalices and the ciboria to the authorities, and worse, in the minds of their critics, had given the books of prayers and rituals to the government. Many others had run off from their parishes, afraid they'd be caught up in the persecution. So rather than suffering with their people, they headed to the hills, waited for things to die down, then picked up where they left off when they returned. Some of the priests stayed and were persecuted. Some were executed, some were put in jail, others were tortured. And when the persecution passed, lots of leaders decided they'd just get on with life as if nothing had happened. And that didn't sit well with the average parishioner. Many of them had also suffered from the persecution, and all of them faced its threat. For their leaders to have abandoned their leadership and then presume everybody would just forget it had happened turned into a giant scandal. Many people felt as if the church had failed them. In fact, many people refused to go back to their parish priests. They chose to go to Mass and have their children baptized only by the priests who had been faithful. Only heroes deserved to be listened to, was their approach. Certainly only those who had suffered for the faith were worthy to celebrate the Last Supper and enact the sacrament Jesus had left for his suffering church. In fact, the division was even more central. Many people maintained that unless a priest had remained, unless he was one of the heroic ones, the sacraments he celebrated were simply null and void. They had no grace in them. One of these other priests might be in his parish and serving the people, but his sacraments were empty. That's what people said. It caused consternation everywhere. Not only were they talking about the efficacy of the clergy and who ought to qualify being a priest, they were, by extension, talking about what a sacrament ought to be and how we ought to benefit from them. It went right to the heart of the life of belief. This conversation was so heated and the division was so widespread, it caused a rent in the church. Eventually, the church became two churches. In the diocese St. Augustine became the bishop of, there were two Catholic churches in town, the one where he celebrated Mass and the one where these others celebrated. In fact, they were side by side, so close they could hear each other singing on Sunday morning. It was a mess. Not only were there different opinions on how to address the betrayal of the clergy, and no one knew exactly what to do. Those who supported the heroic clergy had a good point. The ones who stayed and suffered really did seem to be a step above the others, who were cowardly and apparently sniveling. But the bigger issue was one everybody had to digest, which was that if we are depending only on heroic, brave, super clergy, then the church will ultimately suffer. Since priests are only men and are like most men, if they have to be extraordinarily brave in order for their sacraments to be effective, then most of us aren't going to be receiving them because there won't be anyone to minister them. Plus, the sacraments give grace as long as an ordained priest is celebrating them. It doesn't matter what kind of guy he is, a hero or a zero. God provides the graces of the sacrament. It's not the virtue of the priest that does. And we thank God for that. But the church had to come to this understanding. It took a long time, as all these things do. St. Monica lived through this controversy and lived through both the divisions as well as their resolution. And as these things go, it was painful and confusing for everyone. Her patience was no doubt tried as she was pushed along by all of the passions unleashed by good and faithful people trying to figure out how best to follow Christ. There is some indication she was on the side of the ones who were pushing for separation. Now, it's no crime to imagine someone could see their point. It did seem like things were being watered down when the bishops there didn't respond with more force against those who had taken off when the trying times began. But she remained within the church. She endured the discipline imposed by the authorities, who didn't run the priests off, who had failed, but kept them on. And she trusted in the outworking of the Holy Spirit in all these things. There is no such thing as a perfect time in the church. First of all, because there is no perfect time in history for anything. And besides, even if there were, what would acknowledging the perfect time do for those who didn't live in it? What does claiming, for example, that say, the 13th century was the perfect example of a culture of faith, and so must have been the best time in the history of the church? What does that do for us who have no choice but to pass our days in this century 800 years removed from it? And secondly, the church is made up of people, and people are broken and limited. None of us can escape our humanity or the humanity of those around us. St. Monica lived out the tough times she was born into, and her holiness was made up of those tough decisions and embarrassing realities. And it is this the case for all of us. We live at a time in which clerical behavior is criticized. Our days are part of the time in which everyone is critical of what bishops say and do, or more pointedly, what they don't say and what they don't do, our holiness might have to become a version of hers. We're invited to live out what she did and ride along with the church as it figures out how best to live and prosper in these, our trying times. More than anything else, St. Monica was a person who persevered amid the ups and downs of a hard life. Her brilliant son was a source of pride, eventually, but he was also one of her greatest pains. She endured the pain so as to enjoy the benefit. Eventually, Monica had to learn to trust God in all things, especially with regard to the moral life and the ultimate conversion of Augustine. Her impatience, her strong personality, her peculiar piety, and her ultimate limitations were all a part of who she was. And because they were also a part of her holiness. As many people have pointed out, we will know one another in heaven because the limitations and hesitations we suffer will remain with us, since they are us. Her holiness is not defective because of her defects. It is particular because of them. Ultimately, her holiness becomes universal. It becomes attractive to all of us in all ages because of them. Monica would probably not have become recognized as a saint unless her son had been so famous. Most certainly, we would not have known much about her except for the fact that Augustine was one of the most prolific authors in the early church, and he wrote a good deal about her example and her influence. Because of this, we know and accept her and her holiness as part of the legacy of our faith. But had she remained unknown, her holiness would still have been real. Remember, to be canonized is literally to have your name added to the list of saints. Were her name unknown and not on the list, she'd still be holy. It's no detraction to note her fame by association. At least we do know of her, and we're better off for it. All saints are invitations to us. We learn and live from them. They are God's gift to us. So it is with St. Monica. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called Kyrie eleison. When I was more concerned about college than about taxes, to worship the eternal Lord looked different to me. I know the sum of our enthusiasms wanes and waxes, as does all appreciation of what we do and see. In those days, all that time ago, we loved spontaneity, or at least we said we did as we gathered to sing and pray. We were the cutting edge, the new truth, the informed laity. All we could invent, if it was different, was our new way. Of course, we noticed there was the set schedule of expectations that attended all the freedom and rebellion we could muster. It took only a few times to dampen our rollicking elation, so even the most pointed desire to pray ended in fluster. Not so much today. Seems to be a premium on what is staid and set. The finest attraction being the oldest option offered from time ago. The days gone by bathed in all the holiness they could get, and the graces offered then will arrive now. New, they will glow. No, God is not just in time gone by, the provenance of the past, has life here and now among the new promises of our day. From all years now flown, if the Lord is real, His graces will last. They will fill our cornered hearts and show, from then to now, the way. That's Kyrie eleison. The invitation we have is always to live our lives in the depths of the faith and close to the Lord in His accompaniment in our journey. We hope that that's what we can do here at Living Catholic. We hope that we can continue this journey together. So I hope that we can join again in the time to come.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.